Sometimes, the biggest sign you've met the right person isn't something you notice when they're around. It's something you notice about yourself. I've been thinking about that lately, mostly because we've been taught to look for the wrong things. We look for butterflies, instant chemistry, constant excitement, the kind of relationship that keeps you checking your phone every 5 minutes, the one that makes your heart race every time their name appears on the screen. And for a while, that can feel like love. But I've started wondering if we've confused emotional intensity with emotional security. Because when I look at the healthiest relationships I've ever seen, they don't seem to be built on constant uncertainty. They're built on something much quieter, something people rarely talk about. The people in those relationships still miss each other, still laugh together, still have disagreements, still have moments where life becomes complicated. But underneath all of that, there's a feeling that's difficult to describe. Not excitement, not obsession, not the fear of losing someone, just a quiet sense that you're finally allowed to stop holding your breath. I don't think many of us realize how exhausting it is to constantly wonder what another person is thinking, to reread conversations, to analyze the time between replies, to question whether one small change in tone means something bigger. You become so used to carrying that uncertainty that it starts feeling normal. Then, one day, you meet someone who doesn't make you do any of that. At first, it almost feels strange. There's no mystery to solve, no emotional roller coaster to survive, no constant need for reassurance, just clarity. And that's the part that surprises people, because peace doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes, it feels unfamiliar. I've come to believe that's why so many people overlook healthy relationships. They're waiting for fireworks while quietly walking past someone who makes life feel lighter instead. So, today, I don't want to talk about the obvious signs, the ones you've heard 100 times before. I want to talk about the quieter ones, the changes that happen inside you when the right person has already become part of your life. Because looking back, those changes usually tell you more than grand romantic gestures ever could. And I think the first one is also the easiest to miss. Not because it's small, because it feels so natural you hardly notice it happening. Number 1, you stop trying to decode everything. I think almost everyone has experienced this at least once. You send a message. An hour goes by, nothing. You tell yourself they're probably busy. Then another hour passes. Without realizing it, your mind quietly gets to work. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I shouldn't have sent that last message. It's amazing how quickly our minds can build an entire story from one unanswered text. The strange thing is, it isn't really about the message. It's about uncertainty. When we don't feel emotionally secure, our minds naturally start looking for clues. Every reply becomes evidence. Every delay means something. Every change in tone feels important. You're no longer simply talking to someone, you're investigating them. I've noticed people in these relationships often become experts at reading tiny details, the full stop at the end of a sentence, the emoji that wasn't there this time, the way good morning suddenly became morning. They aren't overthinking because they enjoy it. They're overthinking because uncertainty quietly trains them to. Then something different happens. You meet someone whose actions and words don't constantly contradict each other, someone who doesn't make affection feel unpredictable, someone whose consistency becomes louder than their promises. And without even realizing it, your mind starts becoming quieter. You stop checking when they were last online. You stop rereading conversations before you go to bed. You stop asking your friends, what do you think they meant by this? Not because you've stopped caring, because you've stopped doubting. I've always found that fascinating. People think the right relationship gives you more reasons to think about the other person. Sometimes it gives you fewer. Not because the connection is weaker, because it no longer requires constant analysis. You simply experience it. I've realized that's one of the quietest forms of emotional safety. It's the freedom to believe someone means what they say without feeling the need to search for hidden meanings. And maybe that's what trust really looks like. Not blind faith,
Not certainty that nothing will ever go wrong, just the quiet confidence that you don't have to solve the relationship every single day. The irony is, many people mistake this feeling for boredom. They'll say, "There's no spark. It doesn't feel as intense." But perhaps what disappeared wasn't the chemistry. Perhaps it was the anxiety. And those two feelings are much easier to confuse than most people realize. Because when you've spent a long time associating love with uncertainty, peace can feel unfamiliar at first. But once you've experienced it, it's surprisingly difficult to settle for anything less. And I've noticed something else. When you stop worrying about being accepted, you slowly stop editing yourself. Without planning to, you begin showing up as the version of yourself that feels most natural. Which brings us to the second sign, one that's far more revealing than simply being able to be yourself.
Number 2. You feel safe enough to be imperfect. I've always found it interesting how differently people behave depending on who they're with. Around some people, you become strangely careful. You replay conversations after the end. You wonder if you talked too much or not enough. You think about a joke that didn't land, a message that sounded awkward, a moment you wish you could take back. It's almost like you're carrying around an invisible editor, one that's constantly asking, "Did I say the right thing? Do they still see me the same way? What if I ruined it?" The strange part is, you don't even realize you're doing it. It becomes normal. You start believing relationships are supposed to feel this way, that love requires constant self-monitoring. Then something changes. You meet someone, and for the first time in a long time, you say something embarrassing. Maybe you tell a story that doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe you laugh too loudly in a quiet restaurant. Maybe you send a message with a typo, or accidentally call them instead of texting. For a split second, you brace yourself. Then, nothing happens. They laugh with you, or they don't even notice. The moment passes. The relationship doesn't suddenly feel fragile. I've come to believe that's one of the quietest signs you found someone emotionally safe. Not that you never make mistakes, but that your mistakes stop feeling dangerous. You no longer feel like one awkward moment could undo everything you've built. That's incredibly freeing, because pretending to be perfect is exhausting. I've noticed that people often say, "The right person lets you be yourself." I think there's a deeper truth hiding underneath that. The right person doesn't just accept the polished version of you, they make you less interested in performing altogether. You stop rehearsing texts before sending them. You stop wondering if you sounded clever enough. You stop filtering every opinion in case it changes how they see you. Without realizing it, you begin relaxing into your own personality. The funny thing is, that's usually when people become their most attractive. Not because they're trying harder, because they're trying less. They're no longer chasing approval. They're simply present. I don't think we talk about that enough. Some relationships quietly convince you that love has to be earned, that every conversation is another opportunity to prove your value. Healthy relationships tend to teach the opposite, that you're allowed to be human, allowed to have awkward days, allowed to misunderstand each other, allowed to say, "I handled that badly," without secretly fearing it'll end everything. And maybe that's what emotional safety really is. Not the absence of mistakes, the absence of fear surrounding them. Once that fear disappears, something else begins changing too. The relationship slowly stops depending on extraordinary moments, because somehow the ordinary ones begin meaning even more. Number 3. Small moments start feeling more important than big ones. When we're younger, it's easy to believe love is built from big moments. The first date, the anniversary, the surprise trip, the expensive gift, the dramatic confession. Those are the moments films usually remember. But I've started noticing something different. When people look back on the happiest relationships of their lives, they rarely begin with those stories. Instead,
they remember things that almost sound insignificant. The drive home from buying groceries, making dinner together while arguing about the recipe, laughing because one of you completely forgot what you walked into the room for, stopping for coffee on a rainy morning, folding laundry while talking about absolutely nothing. If someone else watched those moments, they'd probably think, "That's it?" But somehow, those are the memories people protect the most. I've wondered why that is. I think it's because extraordinary moments happen occasionally. Ordinary moments happen every day. And eventually, that's where a relationship actually lives. Not in holidays, not in birthdays, but in the thousands of small hours in between. I've noticed something else. When you've found the right person, silence changes too. You don't feel pressure to keep the conversation alive every second. You can sit together, watch the world go by, and somehow it still feels like time well spent. Nothing remarkable is happening, yet you wouldn't rather be anywhere else. That's a strange feeling, because it has very little to do with excitement and almost everything to do with comfort. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about healthy relationships. People expect them to become memorable because extraordinary things keep happening. In reality, they become memorable because ordinary things stop feeling ordinary. Making breakfast together, walking through a supermarket, waiting for food at a restaurant, listening to music in complete silence. None of those moments sound impressive when you describe them, but somehow they become the moments you miss the most. The right person has a quiet way of changing your relationship with everyday life. Without trying, they make ordinary Tuesdays feel more valuable than someone else's perfect weekend. Looking back, I don't think that's because those moments are exciting. It's because they become peaceful. And when peace starts becoming your favorite part of love, you realize you've been measuring relationships the wrong way all along. But that doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Disagreements still happen. Misunderstandings still happen. The difference isn't that problems disappear. It's what those problems stop feeling like. And I think that's one of the clearest signs of all.
Number 4. Problems stop feeling like a threat to the relationship. I've noticed something about people who haven't experienced a healthy relationship before. Arguments don't just feel uncomfortable, they feel dangerous. One disagreement, and suddenly your mind starts racing. What if this changes everything? What if they're about to leave? Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. So, instead of talking honestly, you start choosing your words carefully. Not because you're trying to be kind, because you're trying to keep the relationship alive. I've seen people apologize for things they didn't actually believe were wrong, stay quiet about things that genuinely mattered to them, pretend they were okay simply because they were afraid honesty would cost them the relationship. That's a heavy way to love someone. Then something quietly changes. You disagree with the right person, not over anything dramatic. Maybe one of you feels unheard. Maybe plans fall through. Maybe one of you says something that comes out the wrong way. For a moment, you expect the usual pattern: distance, silence, someone shutting down. Instead, something surprising happens. The conversation continues. Neither of you is trying to win. Neither of you is trying to prove who's right. You're simply trying to understand what happened. I've always thought that's one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. The goal quietly changes. It stops being, how do I protect myself? And it becomes, how do we protect this relationship? That's a completely different mindset. Healthy relationships don't avoid difficult conversations. They survive them. Sometimes they even become stronger because of them. Not because conflict is enjoyable, because every difficult conversation becomes another opportunity to prove something. We're still here. We're still listening. We're still choosing each other. The funny thing is, you don't stop having disagreements. You stop fearing what disagreements mean. You no longer see every misunderstanding as the beginning of the end. You start seeing them as part of learning another human being. I've come to believe that's one of the biggest differences between emotional security and emotional anxiety.
Emotional anxiety hears, "We need to talk," and immediately thinks, "I'm about to lose them." Emotional security hears the exact same words and thinks, "Something matters to them, let's figure it out." That shift changes everything, because once you're no longer protecting the relationship from every problem, you can finally start growing inside it. And that's when another quiet change begins to appear, one that has nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with who you're becoming. Number 5. You start liking the version of yourself around them. I don't think we ask this question often enough. Most people ask, "How do they make me feel?" It's an important question, but I think there's another one that's even more revealing. Who do I become when I'm with them? I've watched people enter relationships where they slowly became quieter, more anxious, more defensive. They laughed less, questioned themselves more, spent so much energy trying to avoid doing the wrong thing that they forgot what it felt like to relax. At first, they blamed themselves. They thought, maybe I'm just stressed. Maybe this is what relationships are like. But then I've watched the opposite happen. Someone meets a different person, and without making a conscious decision, they begin changing. Not because they're trying to impress anyone, because something inside them finally feels safe enough to unfold. They laugh more easily. They become curious again. They stop apologizing for taking up space. Their confidence doesn't become louder, it becomes quieter, more natural. I've always found that fascinating. The right person doesn't just appreciate your best qualities. Sometimes they quietly create the conditions for those qualities to appear. You become more patient, not because they asked you to, because you're no longer living in a constant state of emotional uncertainty. You become more generous, more playful, more open. Not because you've changed who you are, because you're finally becoming who you've always been underneath the fear. One day, someone points it out. Maybe a friend says, "You seem happier lately," or "You're smiling a lot more these days." You hadn't even noticed, because the biggest changes usually happen gradually. I've heard people say, "I miss them," but every now and then, someone says something much deeper without realizing it. They don't just miss the person, they missed who they were when they were together. I've thought about that for a long time, because I don't think healthy love simply adds another person to your life. It gives you more room to become yourself. Not a perfect version, not a different version, a freer version. One that's less guarded, less afraid, less exhausted. Looking back, I think that's one of the quietest gifts the right relationship can offer. It doesn't ask you to become someone else. It quietly gives you permission to stop hiding the person you already are. And once you've experienced that, something else begins happening. You still miss them when they're not around, but the feeling itself starts changing. It no longer comes from fear, it comes from something much healthier. And that's where the next sign begins.
Number 6. You miss them without feeling insecure. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of a healthy relationship. People often confuse missing someone with worrying about them. Those aren't the same feeling. One comes from affection, the other comes from fear. At first, they can feel almost identical. Someone leaves for a work trip or goes away for the weekend, or simply has an unusually busy week. And of course, you miss them. You wish they were there to tell about your day. You see something funny and instinctively reach for your phone before remembering they're busy. You walk past their favorite cafe and think they would have liked this. That's completely normal. But there's another kind of missing. The kind that quietly whispers, what if they're forgetting about me? What if this distance changes how they feel? What if they're slowly pulling away? I've noticed that when people spend enough time in emotionally unpredictable relationships, those two feelings begin to blend together. Missing someone automatically creates anxiety, not because distance is painful, because distance has become associated with uncertainty. Then something changes. The right person walks into your life, and for the first time, you discover those feelings can exist separately. You still miss them, sometimes deeply, but the missing feels lighter.
You don't spend the evening wondering if they're losing interest. You don't stare at your phone waiting for proof that everything is still okay. You don't create imaginary conversations in your head about what might have changed. Instead, you simply look forward to seeing them again. It's a surprisingly peaceful feeling. I've always thought that was interesting, because nothing has actually changed about distance itself. They're still away, you're still apart. The only thing that's changed is the foundation underneath the relationship. Trust quietly replaces uncertainty. And once that happens, distance stops feeling like a test. It simply becomes part of life. I think that's one of the quietest signs you've found the right person. Their absence doesn't make you question their presence. You don't need constant reassurance to believe you're loved. Not because you've become less emotional, because you've become more secure. The irony is, people sometimes mistake this for caring less. They'll say, "I don't miss them the way I used to." But perhaps what disappeared wasn't the love. Perhaps it was the anxiety. Real love doesn't always become louder over time. Sometimes it becomes calmer. And once you've experienced that kind of calm, you begin noticing something else, not just when they're away, but every single day they're with you. The relationship itself starts feeling different. Not more exciting, something much rarer than that. Number 7, life feels more peaceful than dramatic. If someone asked me what the biggest sign of a healthy relationship is, I don't think I'd say happiness or passion or even compatibility. I think I'd say peace. Not because the relationship is perfect, because it no longer feels like survival. I've noticed something over the years. The healthiest couples I've known aren't usually the most dramatic. They aren't constantly breaking up and getting back together. They're not posting grand declarations every week. They're not living from one emotional high to the next. From the outside, their relationship can almost look ordinary. But I don't think ordinary is the right word. I think the better word is steady. There's something deeply comforting about knowing where you stand, about knowing disagreements don't automatically become goodbyes, about knowing love doesn't have to be earned again every morning. That's a kind of peace many people don't realize they've been searching for, because we've been taught to associate love with intensity. Movies celebrate the chase, songs celebrate heartbreak, stories celebrate impossible romance. Very few people celebrate stability. Yet when you talk to couples who've built lasting relationships, they rarely describe constant excitement. They describe feeling at home. I've always loved that description, because home isn't the place where your heart races the fastest. It's the place where your shoulders finally relax. Maybe that's why the right relationship feels so different. You laugh just as much, sometimes even more. You still surprise each other, you still flirt, you still create memories. But underneath all of that, there's a quiet confidence. You stop expecting the relationship to fall apart every time life becomes difficult. You stop looking for hidden meanings behind every conversation. You stop preparing yourself for disappointment before it even arrives. Without realizing it, your mind has more space for life itself, your friendships, your work, your family, your dreams. Because the relationship no longer consumes all of your emotional energy, it supports it. And I think that's something we don't talk about nearly enough. The right relationship doesn't become the center of your entire world. It becomes the place that gives you the strength to enjoy the rest of it. Looking back, I don't think finding the right person is really about finding someone who never disappoints you, or someone who agrees with you all the time, or someone who somehow removes every challenge from your life. I think it's much quieter than that. It's finding someone whose presence slowly changes the way life feels. You stop trying to decode everything. You feel safe enough to be imperfect. Small moments begin meaning more than big ones. Problems stop feeling like threats. You start liking the person you become around them. You miss them without feeling insecure. And perhaps most importantly, life begins feeling more peaceful than dramatic. None of these signs on their own prove you found the right person. Every relationship has difficult seasons. Every couple misunderstands each other sometimes. The difference is the pattern. If these quiet changes keep becoming more true over time, it's worth paying attention. Because healthy love rarely announces itself with fireworks. More often, it arrives so quietly that you only recognize it when you look back and realize how much lighter you've become. Maybe that's why so many people miss it. They're waiting for love to feel louder, when all along it was teaching them what peace feels like. So I'm curious, which of these 7 signs do you think people overlook the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this conversation resonated with you, I hope you'll join me again in the next one.